The mountain trembled long before the sun crested the eastern ridge. Not from an earthquake, not from the shifting of tectonic plates that had built these peaks over millennia. The trembling came from something far older, far more deliberate, the slow, deliberate exhale of a creature who had decided, after centuries of patience, that it had finally had enough. Valdris the Everburn opened one eye. Then the other. The golden irises caught the first pale light of dawn and threw it back in slivered reflections off the cavern walls around him. His scales, each one the size of a shield, each one layered in blacks and deep crimsons that shifted like molten iron, rasped against the stone beneath him as he lifted his enormous head. The sound was enough to send a colony of cave swallows into panic spirals near the ceiling. They chittered and dashed toward the mouth of the cave, desperate to escape the presence of something that had no business sharing their world. Valdris did not notice them. He did not notice much of anything small anymore. 3,047 years of life had worn away his fascination with minutiae. What remained was a vast, cold awareness, a consciousness so large it had become almost geological. He thought in decades, he mourned in centuries, he grew angry in epochs. And today, after an accumulation of grievances so vast it could have filled its own mountain range, Valdris the Everburn was angry. He unfolded himself. The motion took nearly a full minute, each limb extended with the careful precision of something that understood its own terrible weight. Wings that had blotted out the sky over ancient battlefields stretched wide, tearing grooves into the stone ceiling of his cavern home. His tail, thick as the trunk of an old-growth oak, ridged with bony plates that could shear through castle walls, swept behind him in a long, languid arc. When he stood at full height within the cavern, his snout nearly touched the vaulted ceiling 60 feet above. He looked down at the thing clutched in his front claw. It was a scroll, not parchment. Dragons did not use the skins of lesser creatures for their correspondence. This was a strip of metal, thin as a leaf, etched with runes that glowed faintly amber in the dim light. The script was Drakathic, the old language, the one that had existed before humans had even learned to shape their first primitive syllables. It was a language of fire and pressure and geological time, and it could not be translated by any human scholar who had ever lived. But Valdris was not writing for humans. Not yet. He unrolled the metal scroll with surprising delicacy, scanning the etchings he had inscribed over the course of the previous 3 nights. 3 nights of careful work, 3 nights of forcing himself to sit still long enough to burn each rune into the metal with a claw tip heated to white fire. The document was long, detailed, meticulously organized into sections and subsections, each grievance catalogued with dates approximated to the nearest decade, each offense classified by severity. At the top, in runes larger than the rest, was the title. Formal complaint against the species Homo sapiens, collectively REFERNCD herein as humans. Filed by VALDRIS the EVERBURN, third of the 7th brood, kin to ASHMAW the World Breaker, sworn to the Code of Ancient Wing. Below that, a subtitle. Demanding immediate adjudication by the Council of Elders, with recommended penalty of species-wide correction. Valdris read through it one final time. His expression, as much as a dragon's face could be said to hold expression, did not change, but something in the set of his jaw tightened. Something in the slow rhythm of his breathing hitched just barely on a particular passage near the middle of the document. It was the section about the children. He folded the scroll carefully and tucked it into a satchel woven from actual storm clouds, a gift from a thunder elemental he had bested in combat 800 years prior. The satchel hung from a chain of linked platinum around his neck, and it was one of the few possessions he owned that he considered irreplaceable. Then he walked out of his mountains. The village of Heron's Crossing sat in the valley below the mountain that the locals called Draken's Spire. It was a modest settlement, perhaps 400 souls, a church with a leaning steeple, a market square that smelled of livestock and fresh bread on good days and mud and desperation on bad ones. The buildings were timber and stone, the roads were packed earth, and the people were the kind of hard-bitten, close-mouthed folk who had learned long ago that drawing attention to yourself in a world that contained dragons was a good way to stop being alive. Old Marta Brennan was the first to see him. She was hanging laundry in the gray pre-dawn light, her fingers numb from the cold, her back aching the way it always ached now that she had crossed 70 winters. She had hung a linen shirt on the line and was reaching for a woolen stocking when the shadow passed over her. It was not the shadow of a cloud. Marta had spent 7 decades studying the sky from this valley. She knew every cloud formation, every trick of light that the mountains could produce. This shadow was wrong. It was too defined, too sharp-edged. It moved with purpose. She looked up. The dragon filled the sky from one horizon to the other. Marta did not scream. Screaming was for people who had not yet accepted their own mortality, and Marta had made peace with hers years ago. She simply stood there, a woolen stocking in one hand, a wooden clothespin in the other, and watched as the largest living thing she had ever seen descended toward the valley floor with the slow, controlled grace of something that knew exactly how frightening it was and did not care. Valdris landed in the market square. The impact knocked over 3 carts, shattered every window within 100 yards, and sent a pressure wave rolling through the village that knocked people off their feet and rattled doors in their frames. Dust rose in a great billowing cloud. The cobblestones beneath the dragon's claws cracked and subsided, forming a shallow crater. When the dust cleared, Valdris stood in the center of the square like a monument to an older, more terrible world. His wings were folded against his flanks. His tail curled around the base of the ruined fountain at the square's center. His head was raised, nostrils flaring, tasting the air. And he waited. People emerged from their homes slowly, tentatively. They clustered in doorways and peered around corners with the wide, frozen eyes of prey animals that knew the predator had already seen them. Children were grabbed and pulled inside. A man who had been running toward the square, Aldrich the blacksmith, a man built like a barrel and twice as stubborn, skidded to a halt at the edge of the crater and simply stared. Valdris looked at them. 400 humans, maybe a few more, small, soft, breakable things wrapped in cloth and false courage. He could have killed every last one of them in the time it took to draw a single breath. He could have turned the valley into a glass-lined crater without breaking a sweat, without quickening his pulse, without feeling anything at all. That was precisely what the complaint was about. Not that he wanted to kill them, he didn't. That was the part that humans never seemed to understand, the part that made the rage so much harder to contain. He didn't want to kill them, he wanted them to stop making him feel like he should. "Where is your leader?" Valdris said. His voice was not loud in the way that human voices were loud. It did not come from his throat in a burst of air and vibration. It came from somewhere deeper, from the chest cavity that housed a furnace capable of melting stone, from the ancient resonance of a body that had been shaped by forces predating human civilization. When Valdris spoke, the sound did not merely enter the ears. It passed through the body. It vibrated in the bones. It made the teeth ache and the stomach clench and the eyes water. No one answered. A woman near the back of the crowd fainted. A child began to cry and was swiftly muffled against its mother's chest. The village priest, Father Corbin, a thin man with nervous hands and a faith that had never been truly tested, stepped forward with his crucifix raised and his lips moving in a prayer that came out as a stammering whisper. Valdris looked at the crucifix. He had seen symbols before. Humans loved their symbols. They scratched them into walls, wore them around their necks, painted them on banners, killed each other over differences in their interpretation. In 3,000 years, Valdris had watched humans invent and discard more religions than he had scales, and every single one of them had claimed to be the final word from the creator of the universe. He found it exhausting. "Your leader," he repeated, with the patience of someone who had learned, over millennia, that repetition was the only reliable tool for communicating with a species that was fundamentally deaf to reason. Mayor Tobias Hale was not a brave man. He had never claimed to be. He had taken the position because no one else wanted it and because it came with a modest stipend that helped feed his 5 children. He was 53 years old, soft around the middle, bald on top, and possessed of a lifelong terror of anything that could not be reasoned with using money, polite conversation, or a modest bribe. Dragons, in his experience, responded to none of these. But he was the mayor, and the dragon was asking for him, or rather demanding him. There was a difference in tone that Tobias felt in his marrow, and the difference was the gap between a request and an earthquake. He walked into the square on legs that felt like they had been assembled from wet rope. His knees shook, his hands shook, even his jaw shook, which made it difficult to form words. But he walked and he stopped at the edge of the crater, and he looked up and up and up, at the face of something that could have been carved from the heart of a dead star, and he said, I'm the mayor, Tobias Hale, what do you want?" Valdris lowered his head. This was the part that always unsettled humans the most, not the fire, not the size, not the destruction. It was the moment when a dragon brought its face close to a human, and the human realized with sickening clarity that the creature was intelligent. Not animal intelligent, not clever pet intelligent. Intelligent in the way that philosophers were intelligent, in the way that old generals were intelligent, in the way that something that had spent 3,000 years thinking about the nature of existence was intelligent. The eyes were the worst. Golden, slit-pupiled, and filled with a depth of awareness that made humans feel like they were being looked at from the inside out. "I have filed a complaint," Valdris said, his voice dropping to a register that made the ground hum, "against your species." Tobias blinked, then blinked again. The words did not compute. They were too strange, too bureaucratic, too utterly out of place in a scene that should have been about fire and death and screaming. A complaint, like a citizen petitioning the magistrate about a noisy neighbor. A complaint, Tobias repeated. Oh yes, against the humans. Collectively. Tobias's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked like a fish pulled from a stream, gasping at an atmosphere it was never designed to breathe. Behind him, the crowd murmured a low, anxious sound like the buzzing of a hive that had been struck. Sir, I don't understand. Who have you filed this complaint with? The Council of Elders. Tobias waited for elaboration. None came. I'm sorry, I don't. Who are the Council of Elders? The eldest of my kind. There are 7 remaining. They reside in the deep places of the world where your species has not yet learned to reach. I have submitted my grievance to them in the formal script, as is my right under the Code of Ancient Wing, and they have agreed to hear it. And what happens if they agree with your complaint? Valdris did not answer immediately. His eyes, those terrible, beautiful, ancient eyes, shifted from Tobias to the crowd behind him. They moved slowly, scanning the faces. The terrified mothers, the frozen fathers, the wide-eyed children. The old woman still standing by her laundry line with her stocking in her hand, watching the scene with the calm detachment of someone who had already decided that whatever happened next was out of her control. Correction, Valdris said finally. The word hung in the air like a blade. What kind of correction? Tobias asked, in a voice that had shrunk to almost nothing. The kind that ensures the behavior ceases. The dragon did not destroy the village. This was paradoxically more frightening than if he had. Destruction was simple. Destruction was something the human mind could categorize and process: fire, death, grief, rebuilding. It was terrible, but it was known. It had a shape. What Valdris did instead was sit down. He settled into the market square like a cat curling up on a rug, folding his limbs beneath him, tucking his wings tight against his body and resting his chin on the ground. From this position, his eyes were still level with a standing human's chest. He could have reached out and swallowed someone whole without unfolding a single limb. And he waited. He waited for 3 days. On the first day, the village tried to pretend it wasn't happening. People went about their business as best they could, giving the enormous dragon in the market square a wide berth and speaking in hushed, disbelieving tones. The baker opened his shop. The blacksmith fired his forge. Farmers went out to check their fields, though they kept one eye on the mountain at all times. Valdris did nothing. He barely moved. He breathed slow, deep, rumbling breaths that sent periodic waves of heat rolling across the square, and he watched. His golden eyes tracked every movement in the village with the patient attention of something that had learned over millennia that the most important things in any ecosystem were the small, quiet ones that everyone else overlooked. On the second day, people from neighboring villages began to arrive. Word had spread, it always did, with dragons involved. Messengers on horseback had ridden through the night, and by mid-morning the roads into Heron's Crossing were clogged with carts and wagons and people on foot. They came to gawk. They came to pray. Some came with weapons they knew would be useless because the alternative, coming with nothing at all, felt too much like surrender. A group of soldiers arrived from the capital, 40 men in chainmail with pikes and crossbows. Their captain, a young man named Aldous Greer with a jaw like an anvil and a mustache, he was clearly very proud of, rode to the edge of the crater, dismounted, and drew his sword. "Dragon," he shouted, in the theatrical voice of someone who had trained for this moment at the academy and was determined to perform it properly. "By order of King Alaric III, you are commanded to vacate this settlement immediately and present yourself for adjudication at the Royal." Valdris looked at him. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply looked at Captain Aldous Greer with the same expression that a human might turn upon an ant that had wandered onto their dinner plate, not with malice, not with anger, but with a kind of profound, almost philosophical disinterest. Greer's sword arm lowered. Then his whole body lowered as though an invisible hand had pressed down on his shoulders. His face went the color of old ash. He sheathed his sword, remounted his horse without a word, and rode back to his men. Within the hour, the soldiers had set up camp on the far side of the valley, as far from the dragon as geography allowed. On the third day, Valdris moved for the first time since he had sat down. He reached into his cloud satchel with a claw and withdrew the metal scroll. It unrolled with a faint sound like wind chimes, the runes along its surface glowing more brightly now, pulsing with a warm amber light that made the air shimmer. Then he spoke. Not to the mayor, not to the soldiers, not to any individual. He spoke to the valley itself, and every living thing in it heard his words not as sound but as meaning, translated by some ancient magic woven into the Dracathic script into something each listener could understand, regardless of their native tongue. "I am Valdris the Everburn. I have lived for 3,047 of your years. In that time I have watched your species emerge from caves and mud huts. I have watched you learn to forge metal, to build cities, to sail your oceans, to chart your stars. I have watched you wage your wars, write your poems, bury your dead, and birth your young. I have watched all of it. He paused, the amber light of the scroll pulsed. And I have filed a formal complaint against you, all of you. The details of this complaint are as follows. The scroll hovered in the air beside him, supported by nothing visible, and the runes began to glow one by one as Valdris read from them. Grievance 1, Unprovoked Hunting. Over the past 2,000 years, your species has hunted mine to the edge of extinction. There were once 12,000 dragons in the world. There are now fewer than 200. You have not hunted us for food. You have not hunted us for territory. You have hunted us for our scales, which you use for armor, for our blood, which you use in your alchemical potions, for our bones, which you grind into powder for your folk remedies, and for our hearts, which your warriors eat in the belief that it will grant them courage. The glow intensified. In the year 1412, by your reckoning, a hunting party led by a man called Tormund the Bold tracked and killed my sister, Sarathas the Gentle-Winged, as she slept. She was 400 years old. She had never harmed a human. She spent her life tending to the wild forests of the northern range, planting trees with magic that your species does not possess and cannot replicate. Tormund's men cut off her head and carried it back to your king as a trophy. It was mounted on the gate of Whitehall Castle, where it remained for 230 years, rotting in the rain, until a storm finally blew it down. Valdris's voice did not change in volume or pitch, but something in the quality of the air shifted, a subtle increase in pressure, a faint smell of ozone, the sense that the ground beneath everyone's feet had become slightly less stable. Grievance 2, Habitat Destruction. Your species breeds like insects and spreads like disease. In my lifetime, I have watched you destroy 90% of the old forests. You have drained the marshlands. You have dammed the rivers. You have torn open the mountains for stone and metal. You have built your cities on top of every wild place that once sustained us, and you have done so without consultation, without compensation, and without a single moment of consideration for the creatures who lived there first. Grievance 3, Cultural Erasure. Your bards sing songs about dragons that depict us as monsters. Your priests preach sermons that name us demons. Your storytellers tell your children tales in which we are always the enemy, always the beast to be slain, always the obstacle between the hero and his glorious destiny. You have made us into symbols of evil in your culture, and you have done so deliberately, because it is easier to justify the extermination of a species if you first convince yourself that they deserve it. Grievance 4. Here Valdris stopped. The scroll's glow flickered just for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, harder, colder, but also, and this was the part that made the listeners feel something they did not expect from a dragon's voice, cracked. Not broken, not shattered, but cracked like a stone that had been struck once too often in the same place. Grievance 4, The Children. Silence, complete, absolute silence. 400 villagers and 1,000 visitors and 40 soldiers all held their breath at the same time, because there was something in the way the dragon said the word children that reached past every defense they had. 600 years ago, a human settlement at the base of the Varath Mountains discovered a dragon hatchling. A child by any honest definition. Newly emerged from its egg, blind, helpless, crying for its mother, your people found it. And instead of leaving it, instead of recognizing it for what it was, a baby, an infant, a thing that deserved the same mercy that your own infants are granted as a matter of basic decency, they killed it. They killed it and mounted its body on a pole and paraded it through the village as a trophy. The temperature in the square rose by several degrees. The cobblestones beneath Valdris began to glow faintly red, heat radiating upward from the furnace of his body. I found that hatchling 3 days later. I had been tracking its mother's scent, Sarathas's friend, Usarith, who had gone searching for her missing egg. Usarith was frantic. She had torn apart half a mountainside looking for her child. When I found the hatchling's body on that pole, covered in human laughter and human filth, I had to tell Usarith what had happened to her baby. Valdris's eyes closed, just for a moment. When they opened again, the gold had deepened to something closer to molten iron. Usarith flew into the sun that night. She climbed until the air was too thin to hold her wings, and she kept climbing, and she did not stop. I watched her burn. I could have stopped her. I should have stopped her. But I did not, because in that moment I understood her. I understood the desire to leave a world that could do such a thing, and I have carried that failure, my failure to save her, my failure to save her child, for 600 years. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of shame, full of recognition, full of the terrible weight of a shared understanding that cut across the boundary between species. Every parent in that square, human or otherwise, understood what had been lost that day. Every person who had ever held a child, who had ever felt the desperate, cloying love that comes with the responsibility for a small and helpless life, understood. And every person also understood in that moment that they were not the ones who had killed the hatchling. It had happened 600 years ago to people they had never known, in a place they had never been. But they understood that they were connected to those people by the same chain of species, the same unbroken line of human choices that had led from that village to this one, and that the dragon's grievance was not against individuals but against the collective, against the species itself. As a continuous entity, as a thing that learned and forgot and never, ever seemed to remember the lessons that mattered. Valdris read the remaining grievances without pause. There were 19 more. They covered everything from the theft of dragon eggs for use in royal banquets to the use of dragon remains in so-called medicine that did nothing except separate the desperate from their coin. Each grievance was specific. Each was dated. Each was, by any objective standard, a legitimate complaint filed by a sentient creature against a species that had, over the course of 3 millennia, demonstrated a consistent and escalating pattern of exploitation, cruelty, and extermination. When he finished, Valdris rolled the scroll closed and tucked it back into his satchel. The Council of Elders will convene in 1 month's time at the deep hollow beneath the Karath Range. They will review my complaint, hear any defense your species wishes to offer, and render a verdict. I am instructed to inform you that you may send one representative, one human, to speak on your species' behalf. He looked at the crowd. Choose carefully. The argument about who to send lasted 3 weeks. It was, by all accounts, the most fractious and bitter debate in the history of the kingdom. Every lord, every priest, every scholar, every general, every self-important man with a title and an opinion demanded to be the one to speak for humanity. They wrote long letters to the king outlining their qualifications. They made speeches. They accused each other of cowardice and incompetence, and in one memorable incident of being secretly in league with the dragons. The king, Alaric III, a pragmatic man with a tired face and a crown that gave him headaches, listened to all of it and then did something that surprised everyone. He chose none of them. Send Edric Thane, he said. The room went silent. Chancellor Ashworth was the first to recover. Your Majesty, Edric Thane is a goat farmer. Oh yes. He has no title, no standing, no education in law or diplomacy. He smells of manure and he speaks to his animals more than he speaks to people. Oh yes. Then why? Because he is the only person in this kingdom who has ever successfully talked a dragon out of burning something down. Edric Thane was not a hero. He was 36 years old, tall in a lanky, unfinished way, with a face that looked like it had been designed by committee and rejected by all parties. His nose had been broken twice, once by a falling beam, once by an angry ram, and healed at slightly different angles each time. His hair was the color of dirty straw and behaved as though it had a personal grudge against combs. His hands were large, calloused, and perpetually stained with a combination of goat cheese, lanolin, and soil. He lived alone on a farm at the very edge of the kingdom, where the rolling hills gave way to rocky highland and the air smelled of heather and wild thyme. He had 37 goats, a dog named Mudge, a cat named Disaster, and a donkey named Bartholomew who refused to move for anyone except Edric, and only then when Edric asked politely. He had no wife, no children, no family to speak of unless you counted the goats, which he did, because the goats had never disappointed him and humans consistently had. When the king's messenger arrived at his farm, a young man on a fine horse who looked profoundly out of place in the mud and sheep dung of Edric's yard. Edric was sitting on an overturned bucket, milking a particularly stubborn goat named Gertrude. What? Edric said without looking up. The messenger swallowed, Edric Thane. That's what my mother called me before she left. His Majesty King Alaric III requests your presence at the capital immediately. You have been chosen as humanity's representative in a formal adjudication before the Council of Dragon Elders. Edric's hands did not stop moving on Gertrude's udder. Milk streamed into the pail with a steady, rhythmic sound. No, he said. I'm sorry. No, I'm not going. I have goats to milk. Gertrude here gets mastitis if I skip a milking, and then I have to treat her with a poultice of comfrey and garlic, and she hates the smell of garlic and she kicks, and it's a whole thing. Tell the king thanks but no thanks. The messenger stared at him. Sir, I don't think you understand. A dragon has filed a formal complaint against the entire human species. If the council rules against us, the consequences could be catastrophic. Extinction level. The king himself has chosen you two. I know why he chose me. Then why? Because I'm expendable. Edric finally looked up. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in the thin highland light, and they held a quality that the messenger found deeply unsettling, not anger, not sadness, but a kind of profound, bone-deep weariness that seemed to have settled into the man's features like sediment at the bottom of a still pond. I have no family, no title, no lands of value, no connections. If I die, no one of importance cares. If I fail, the king can say he sent his best and it wasn't good enough, and no one will question it because no one knows who I am. And if by some miracle I succeed, he takes credit for having the wisdom to choose me. It's a perfect political play. Send the nobody. Win either way. The messenger opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. That's a very cynical interpretation. It's the correct one. I've met the king. He came through here once on a hunting trip, stopped at my farm for water, didn't look at me once, looked through me like I was a window. I'm not angry about it, that's just what powerful people do to people like me. But I'm not going to travel across the kingdom and stick my head in a dragon's mouth because the man who looked through me told me to. The messenger left. He came back the next day with the captain of the king's guard and 12 soldiers. Edric was sitting on the same bucket, milking Gertrude. Mr. Thane, the captain said, with the carefully neutral voice of a man who had delivered many unpleasant orders and had learned to stop caring about the details. You will come with us, willingly or not. The king's order is not a request. Edric looked at the soldiers. He looked at their swords and their armor and their hard, professional faces. He looked at Gertrude, who had somehow managed to step in the milk pail during the confusion and was now standing with one hoof in a puddle of fresh goat milk, looking embarrassed. Gertrude, you absolute disaster, Edric muttered. He sighed, he stood up, he set the pail aside. Fine, but someone needs to feed my goats while I'm gone, and if anything happens to Mudge, I will hold the king personally responsible, not in a legal way, in a I will find a way to make him regret it way. Are we clear? They traveled for 12 days. Edric sat in the back of a wagon and watched the landscape change from highland to lowland to forest to plain. He did not speak to the soldiers. He did not read the briefing documents they gave him, thick packets of parchment detailing the dragon's complaint, the history of human-dragon relations, and the legal framework of the Code of Ancient Wing. He simply sat and watched and thought. He thought about the dragon's complaint. He had heard it read aloud in the village square. A copy of the speech had been transcribed by one of the visiting scholars and distributed widely. He had read it once, sitting in his barn with a lantern and a cup of goat's milk, and he had not been able to finish it the first time because the section about the hatchling had made his hands shake. He thought about that a lot. The hatchling, the baby, the tiny, blind, helpless thing that had been killed and mounted on a pole by people who had looked at it and seen not a child but a trophy. He thought about Usarith flying into the sun. He thought about Valdris finding the body and having to tell the mother what had happened. He thought about his own mother who had left when he was 7. He thought about how she had looked at him one morning, really looked at him, for the first time in what felt like years. And he had seen something in her eyes that he had not understood at the time but recognized now with the clarity of 30 years' distance. She had looked at him the way Usarith must have looked at the sky before she flew into it. She had looked at him with love, and with the terrible knowledge that love was not enough to keep her in a world that was grinding her down to nothing. Edric understood something that the lords and the priests and the generals did not. He understood that the dragon's complaint was not about politics or law or territory. It was about grief. It was about a creature that had lived long enough to lose everything, his family, his kind, his purpose, his faith in the world, and who had finally, after millennia of patience, decided to speak that grief aloud in the only language that might be heard. The language of formal complaint, of structured grievance, of a request so reasonable and so measured that it could not be dismissed as mere rage. The dragon was not angry. Edric knew anger. He had been angry at his mother for leaving, at his father for dying, at the world for being what it was. Anger was hot and fast and careless. Anger burned itself out. This was not anger, this was sorrow. Sorrow that had been compressed under the weight of 3,000 years until it had become something harder than diamond, something that could cut through mountains. On the 10th night of the journey, Edric sat by the campfire while the soldiers slept and spoke aloud to no one. What do you say to something that's lost everything because of you? Not you specifically, but you, your kind, your species. The collective you that stretches back thousands of years and forward into a future you can't see. What do you say to a creature that's been more patient than any creature should have to be, and that's finally run out of patience, and that's handled that loss of patience with more dignity than any human has ever shown about anything? Mudge, who had been lying beside him with his head on his paws, thumped his tail once against the ground. Yeah, Edric said, I don't know either. The deep hollow beneath the Kareth Range was not a cave. It was a cathedral. Edric walked into it with a torch in one hand and the briefing documents, which he had finally started reading, not because he thought they would help, but because his hands needed something to hold in the other, and he stopped 10 steps inside and simply stared. The space was vast. The ceiling was lost in darkness, so far above that the torchlight could not find it. The walls were smooth, curved, flowing, not carved by water or chisels, but shaped by something else, something that had pushed the stone into forms that echoed the architecture of no human building. They spiraled and arched and branched like the inside of a great ribcage, and the stone itself was warm to the touch, radiating a faint, steady heat that spoke of something enormous living deep below. But it was the light that stopped him. Crystals, thousands of them embedded in the walls and ceiling, each one the size of a human torso. Each one glowing with a soft interior light that ranged from deep amber to pale gold to occasional flashes of intense white. The light they produced was not electric, not magical in the way that human wizards used magic. It was organic, alive, pulsing gently in rhythm with some slow, deep heartbeat that Edric could feel in his feet through the soles of his boots. And the dragons. There were 7 of them. They were arranged in a rough semicircle at the far end of the hollow, each one resting on a raised platform of smooth stone that had clearly been shaped to accommodate their specific bodies. They were enormous, even the smallest was larger than Valdris, and the largest, a pale-scaled beast that seemed almost translucent in the crystal light, was so big that Edric's mind refused to process its full dimensions. Their eyes were open, all of them. 14 golden eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the torch in his hand feel laughably inadequate. Valdris was there too, standing to the side of the semicircle, his scroll held loosely in one claw. When Edric entered, the dragon's eyes found him and held, and Edric felt something pass between them, not communication exactly but acknowledgement. The recognition of one grieving creature by another. The human representative, said the largest dragon. Its voice was so deep that Edric did not hear it so much as experience it, a full-body sensation, like standing too close to a massive bell as it rang. You are small. Edric swallowed. His mouth had gone completely dry. His legs were shaking. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run, to hide, to get as far away from these creatures as physics would allow. But he thought about the hatchling on the pole. He thought about Usarith in the sun. He thought about his mother's eyes. Yes, he said, I am. And you speak for your species. I know I can't do that. No one can do that. You asked for one representative and the king sent me, but I want to be honest with you, I can't speak for all of humanity. I'm a goat farmer. I don't speak for kings or priests or generals or scholars. I barely speak for my neighbors. The only thing I can speak for is myself. The 7 dragons looked at him. Valdris looked at him. The silence stretched, filled with the slow pulse of crystal light and the deep, rhythmic breathing of creatures so large they generated their own weather. The complaint has been read, said the largest dragon. The human species is accused of systematic extermination, habitat destruction, cultural erasure, and crimes against the young. How do you respond? Edric was quiet for a long time. He set down the torch. He set down the documents. He stood in the warm, crystal-lit darkness of the deep hollow, surrounded by the most powerful creatures on the planet, and he thought about what to say. And then he told the truths. You're right, he said. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Every single thing in that complaint. You're right about the hunting, about the killing, about the hatchling, about all of it. You're right, and I don't have a defense for any of it because there isn't one. He paused, his voice was shaking, but he pushed through it. I read the part about Usarith, about her baby, and I thought about what I would do if someone hurt my dog. Mudge. He's old and he's slow and he's not particularly smart, but he's mine. He sleeps at the foot of my bed and he follows me everywhere, and he's the only living thing in the world that has never once looked at me like I didn't matter. And if someone hurt him, if someone killed him and put his body on a pole and laughed about it, I don't know what I would do. But I know it wouldn't be reasonable. I know it wouldn't be measured. I know it wouldn't be a formal complaint filed with a council. It would be something worse, something that I couldn't take back. And Usarith, she had that moment, she had that feeling, and she flew into the sun. His voice cracked, he pressed on. I can't apologize for my species. An apology from me isn't worth anything, I didn't do those things. But I can tell you that when I read about what happened to that hatchling, I felt sick. I felt ashamed. Not ashamed of myself because I wasn't there, but ashamed of what we are, what we're capable of. The things we do to things that are smaller than us or different from us or that we don't understand. We do it to each other. We've done it to every species we've ever encountered. We do it because we're afraid, and when we're afraid, we destroy the thing that frightens us. And then we tell ourselves stories about how the thing we destroyed was evil and we were brave. He looked up at the 7 elders. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. I don't have a defense, all I have is this, I'm here, I came. Not because the king ordered me to, I didn't want to come. I came because somewhere between my farm and this mountain, I realized that someone needed to stand in front of you and say that you're right, that we've done terrible things, that we've earned your anger, and that I'm sorry, not on behalf of humanity, I don't have that right, but on behalf of myself, one human standing here saying I'm sorry and meaning it. The silence that followed was the longest silence of Edric Thane's life. It lasted minutes or hours or years, he could not have said which. The crystal light pulsed, the dragons breathed, and Edric stood there, shaking and small and utterly insignificant, and he did not look away. The largest dragon stirred. Valdris, it said. Valdris stepped forward. His eyes were fixed on Edric, and something in them had changed. The hardness was still there. 3,000 years of loss did not evaporate in a moment, but it was layered now with something else. Something that Edric, with his limited experience of dragon expressions, could not name. Valdris, the elder said again, your complaint requests species-wide correction. In light of this human's response, do you wish to modify your request? Valdris was silent for a long time. His jaw worked, as though he were chewing on words that were too large and too sharp to swallow. No, he said finally. Edric's stomach dropped. But Valdris continued, and the word hung in the air with a weight that made the crystals flicker. I wish to add an addendum. He withdrew the scroll from his satchel. With a single claw heated to white fire, he burned a new line of runes into the bottom of the metal strip. The light was blinding. The heat washed over Edric like a wave, and he felt the hair on his arm singe and curl, but he did not step back. Valdris held the scroll up for the elders to see. Addendum, the human called Edric Thane is spared from any correction. He is to be left unmolested by dragonkind for the remainder of his natural life. His lands are to be considered neutral ground. His animals are not to be harmed. This is not a reward, this is a recognition. He is the only human in 3,000 years who has stood before us and told the truth without being asked, without being coerced, and without expecting anything in return. Valdris lowered the scroll and looked at Edric. Your species will be corrected, not destroyed. The council does not grant extinction as a remedy, but corrected. You will lose your weapons of dragon slaying. You will lose your knowledge of dragon hunting. You will lose the trade routes that carry our remains as cargo. You will be made to forget slowly, over generations, the methods your ancestors used to hunt us. And in return, we will withdraw to the deep places and leave you to your world. He paused. But you, Edric Thane, will remember. That is your burden. You will remember what we were, what your kind did to us, and what it cost. And you will carry that memory alone because no one will believe you. They will think you mad. They will pity you or fear you or ignore you. And you will carry it anyway because you chose to come here and tell the truth, and the truth does not come without a price. Edric stood in the warm, golden light of the deep hollow, surrounded by ancient creatures that could have unmade him in a breath, and he felt something break open inside his chest. Not pain, not quite, something larger than pain, something that encompassed pain but also included a strange, terrible relief. The relief of being truly seen for the first time in his life by something that understood what it meant to carry a weight too heavy for one creature to bear. Okay, he said. It was not a heroic response. It was not a noble speech. It was the voice of a goat farmer who had been given an impossible burden and had chosen, not with fanfare but with quiet, exhausted acceptance, to carry it. Okay. Edric Thane walked home. It took him 19 days. He walked alone, without escort, through forests and over hills and across rivers, following the same route the wagon had taken but in reverse. He arrived at his farm on a Tuesday evening, with the sun setting behind the highland hills and the smell of heather thick in the air. Gertrude was standing in the middle of his yard, exactly where he had left her. She had somehow broken into the feed shed and was eating grain with the single-minded dedication of a creature that had never once in her life considered the consequences of her actions. Mudge came bounding around the side of the barn, ears flapping, tail wagging so hard that his entire back end was involved in the motion. Disaster, the cat, watched from the porch with an expression of studied indifference that was clearly a lie. Edric stood at the edge of his yard and looked at his farm, the small, drafty house, the ramshackle barn, the muddy paddock with its rusted fence, the hills rolling away into distance, and he felt the weight of the memory settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. He would remember. For the rest of his life, he would remember the deep hollow and the crystals and the 7 elders and the sound of Valdris's voice when he spoke about Usarith. He would remember the hatchling on the pole. He would remember the look in the dragon's eyes when Edric told the truth, not gratitude, not forgiveness, but recognition. The recognition of one honest creature by another. He would carry it alone. No one would believe him, he knew that already. He could see the conversations in his head, the puzzled looks, the awkward silences, the gradual withdrawal of neighbors who had always thought he was a bit strange and now had confirmation. He would be the crazy goat farmer who claimed to have spoken to dragons. He would die alone, probably with nothing but his goats and his dog and his memories. He walked into the yard. Gertrude looked up from the feed shed, grain spilled across her muzzle, and bleated at him with the particular tone of insolent entitlement that only a goat can produce. Yeah, Edric said, I'm back, don't act like you missed me. Mudge pushed his head into Edric's hand. Edric knelt and buried his fingers in the dog's fur and closed his eyes and breathed. He stayed like that for a long time. Then he got up, fixed the fence, milked the goats, fed the animals, and went to bed. The world went on. The correction happened as the council had decreed, slowly, quietly, over the course of generations. Dragon-slaying swords lost their edge literally and figuratively. The old hunting routes were forgotten. The alchemical recipes that called for dragon blood stopped working, or perhaps people simply stopped believing they ever had. The songs changed gradually the way songs always do, until dragons and human stories were less monsters and more mysteries, creatures of the deep places, glimpsed but never grasped, feared but no longer hated. And on a small farm at the edge of the kingdom, a goat farmer grew old. He never married. He never left the highlands again. He sat on his overturned bucket and milked his goats and talked to his dog, and sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was right and the wind carried the smell of heather and wild thyme, he would look toward the mountains and feel something vast and ancient look back. He was the only one who remembered. He carried it anyway.